Hey everyone, this is Michael Hicks. I'm here today to talk to you about a leadership project that took place in my Gene 402 Making of the Christian Leader class at Regent University of March 2019. Let me begin by saying that this assignment had proved to be a unique opportunity in applying the knowledge of leadership that I'd learned over the course of 8 weeks. This helped me evaluate the skills and values and methods and performances of a leader, which I found to be influential in the field of Christian ministry. The following interview discussed will determine this particular leader's strengths and weaknesses, accomplishments and failures, but most importantly, how that individual's approach to leadership conforms or diverges from this model presented in the Kuzi and Posner Leadership Challenge, which was part of the required readings. Also, part of these required readings were from the authors of Joseph Badaracco, Andrew Crouch, Alvin Schmidt, and N.T. Wright, along with other integration and biblically sound principles. Our interviewee for this discussion is a worship and creative pastor named Jonathan Carmichael, who had spent a good portion of 17 years directing, producing, and coordinating worship services. His current position is located in Wichita, Kansas, where my family had been members for several years at Countryside Christian Church. This interview took place during over-the-phone interview due to scheduling constraints, where I had prepared over a dozen questions describing Carmichael's subjective view of leadership, his core values and perspectives on success, and a myriad of other important and relevant issues. Our goal for this particular project were to summarize the results of this interview, critique this leader in light of the 5 practices and 10 commitments found in Christian Reflections on the Leadership Challenge, as well as my own recommendations for improvement. Lastly, this interview will conclude with a reflection of what I had learned over the course of the 402 Making of the Christian Leader class and how I could apply this information in my own leadership experiences. So let me start with a summary of what took place during this interview. In order to summarize the results of this interview, I will give a brief description of what has been discussed, then highlight what was established as relevant in terms of leadership qualities. Much of what has been defined within the criteria for assessment was discovered to relate to strengths, actionability, improvability, organizational skills, behavior, contributions, and the aptitude for handling difficult situations. The interview itself was casual, direct, and brief. Personally, I admire a leader who keeps to a schedule and postures his responses with respectability for their interviewer. This interviewee was prepared and forthcoming about their work history, relationship with coworkers, and how their spiritual life has been affected by their personal and professional life, which is important. Due to the brevity of time, our Q&A segment felt mechanical, but wasn't lacking in personability whatsoever. This exercise resembled the type of morality that N.T. Wright describes in the characterization of James, where people in his church expected him to behave in a particular way in terms of straightforward obligation. This wasn't off-putting. It's a common standard of practice in which many professionals in the secular world are deficient. The authenticity in this interview and interviewee held a refreshing sense of Christian conduct and accountability. For an accurate illustration of the results, we focused primarily on how his efforts for the church were a sanctifying and progressive part of his maturation as a leader, and what this kind of success can manifest as a result. One particular question had to do with how to manage or facilitate improvement. He responded by saying, "Cast your vision or visions on those you serve in a way that is clear and motivates. That is the key to facilitating improvement." N.T. Wright would agree in that our ability to improve the livelihoods of others involve a vision of Christian living that reflects the virtues of the transformation of Jesus himself. Essentially, Jonathan expressed his vision in terms of the Christ-like imagery we have all been asked to imitate in the book of Ephesians, where Paul is commanding, not suggesting, that believers imitate God in how they treat one another. So, our vision is really Christ's vision through our actions. Not only this, but in our value system as well. Jonathan described this process as living out the principles taught in Romans 12:3 and Philippians 2 verses 3 through 4 as what has inspired him to serve one another. Allow me to delve into a bit of the critique into this particular leader. This portion, I have developed a critique for what has been revealed to me according to the responses of Jonathan Carmichael's strengths and weaknesses in relation to the Cousy and Posner model. During the interview, I presented nearly half a dozen questions representing his perspectives on the subjectivity of his character. Concerning these strengths, he has mentioned his ability to be compassionate, caring, humble, and authentic in his aptitude to lead others. This is similar to what Nancy Ortberg suggested in response to a high-level importance. She stated that godliness is narrowed down to integrity, authenticity, joy, and dignity of work. I see this as an interrelated issue where one cannot have integrity without compassion, authenticity without care, joy without submission, or dignity without authentic relational leadership. During the examination of his strengths and weaknesses, I've found all of these characteristics to be present, especially within the admission of fault, which is the most difficult to discuss in terms of honesty and transparency. Carmichael's weaknesses had the personality of promise and self-improvement. It's human nature to avoid confrontation, specifically when it involves loved ones and work associates. He stated, "My weakness is my lack of a desire to confront problems head-on. I am a peacemaker and a peacekeeper, which can be a blessing and a curse." In a reflection from Patrick Laconi, it makes mention of Jim and Barry's perspective on facing challenges head-on. They explain the importance of psychological hardiness is to take change, risk, turmoil, and the strains of life in stride. Carmichael, I believe, understood the importance of embracing these challenges and, like most people, need to develop a thick skin through experience in order to reap the blessings after sowing, in the field of discomfort. If we cannot confront problems, then we risk contributing to the problem and in turn hinder our growth. These situations, although uncomfortable, can be opportunities to mature as leaders in ministry. After all, if a fireman avoids the fire or police officer ignores the assault, how can we be called peacekeepers? Aside from his weaknesses, many strengths were addressed. For instance, in order to possess the qualities of good leadership, we have to learn how to respond or apply our knowledge. Carmichael would say that we should allow people to fail on their own, build trustworthy relationships, empower others with responsibility, and not let our pride get in the way of someone else becoming an even greater leader. That's where we can find our most joy, I believe. Just to piggyback off of that. But my recommendations for improvement, as far as what has already been discussed, I may have no expertise in offering insight into the well-refined model of Christian behavior, but I can learn from the experiences of others and give my impressions. If my only source of leadership was Jonathan Carmichael, for instance, I might have some semblance of how we should treat others, whether that be intentionally leading them in a capacity that requires an upright, above-reproach behavior, or in the unintentional, indirect approach where others may perceive our actions as Christians. Speaking of actions, on the basis of what I've observed, my recommendations relate more towards the improvement of discipline. Andy Crouch, author of Culture Making, Recovering Our Creative Calling, that's fun to say, discusses this facet of belief in relation to grace being essential in the painstaking cultivation for divine blessings on the efforts that are undertaken in dependence and trust on God. Where we may see failure, God sees opportunity. And part of being a great leader is just being a leader, forgoing the pride of greatness and just being a leader first, allowing God to be our source of greatness. However, God's grace is our stepping stone, a stumbling stone and a cornerstone that teaches us to grow in faith while simultaneously offering forgiveness in our lack of discipline. This is precisely the kind of opportunity that develops into a learned discipline in which God allows us to take responsibility in much of the same way Joseph Badaracco alludes to on the topic of a commanding character in Questions of Character, Illuminating the Heart of Leadership. Great book. Here he writes about a story concerning a guy named Captain Conrad from the Secret Sharer, who ultimately finds a way to assert his authority and demonstrate to himself that he can step into his role as a leader despite the stress of commanding a ship. In a sense, to take command of a situation, we need to discipline our character through prayer, fasting, and obedience to the Word in order to help us understand God's purpose for our lives, including how we react, how we take action, and delegate direction. So in Carmichael's case, I would recommend a passage in Romans where Paul says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. His purpose leads us to become better leaders, faithful, forgiving, and fearless of circumstances. So in reflection of the leadership qualities that have already been discussed, in reflection of the passage that has been given in light of Carmichael's critique, let me move into a section that will further elaborate on the reflection on what's been learned from this leadership interview. So here I'm going to give an overview into how this information can be used, particularly in my own leadership experiences, while incorporating the terms from the Leadership Challenge model, as well as other required text on the subject of character, culture, and service. So to begin, I'd like to offer my initial definition of leadership. Of course, we look to Scripture to define what leadership truly is. Selflessness. In this word, we find our greatest difficulty becoming less of ourselves so that God can become more within us. the passage to which I'm referring comes from the book of John. He talks about his membership within the bridegroom as being complete because of his own willingness to become less so he can become greater. When we lack this disposition, it's God's grace that we should be leaning on in our everyday weaknesses, and which still plagues our unbelief, our unwillingness to surrender to His will. N.T. Wright states that the never-ending wonder of genuine Christian living is that God has come to meet us right there in our confusion of pride and fear, of mess and muddle and downright rebellion and sin. Alvin Schmidt, author of How Christianity Changed the World, discusses how a Christian's willing heart is in direct relationship to the subjective calling being felt by the vocationally minded. Once we embrace the understanding that there are no low status or high status work, good work or bad work, where it makes no difference what kind of work the Christian did, so long as he performed it to the glory of God, we can learn to humble ourselves, become selfless with a desire to give generously, for if the willingness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what one does not have. What we do and must have is the eagerness to encourage others through our actions that Christ is our saving grace, who has gifted us with the ability to serve a body of potential believers as ambassadors of Christ. As we hearten others in developing their competence of character, we develop enablers, we become enablers of their success. Over a period of time, as all things take, we take on a role of overseer in training up leaders and becoming leaders themselves. Ortberg reflection would concur that the most powerful words a leader can say to who is being led are, "I am committed to your success." A selfless leader is one who cares more for the growth in others than they do in themselves. I believe Jonathan Carmichael expressed this succinctly in his responses. In answering how I might be able to apply these principles to my own leadership experiences, I would refer to the Benedictine proverb, "To work is to pray." This applies to how we contrast our workability and our prayer life. Both should be as interdependent as we rely on breathing for survival. In the book of Thessalonians, Paul places importance on prayer as a Christian's key to leadership. He states simply to rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. The point is, our leadership ability hinders on our relationship with God through our prayer life. We listen to God by prayerfully seeking His wisdom. Then we can apply this knowledge in our personal and professional and spiritual lives. Concerning my life, I'm always lacking in these attributes, but I am eternally grateful for Christ's leadership, which enables me to become more like Him. Someone who indwells me, guides me, loves me, and encourages me to succeed. So I hope you enjoyed this critique. I'm going to go ahead and tag you, Jonathan, into it. Hopefully you get something out of it. I guess it's not often that we get feedback, especially when someone's contributing to worship service or some part of of the church itself vocationally. So thank you so much for everything that you're doing as your leadership. Thank you for everybody part of staff at Countryside Christian Church. I'm learning myself, so thank you for teaching. Thank you for just giving all that joy every week, giving all your effort, all your willingness, and God bless. Hopefully there's more videos coming out. I'm going to do on as many people as possible because I feel it's important for accountability's sake. And that's it. Hope you enjoyed what you heard.